The teacup rattled as I set it down, her voice still echoing across the garden. "Careful," my daughter-in-law said with a smirk. "Save your energy, you'll need it for the nursing home." My own son didn't defend me. He just sipped his coffee and looked away. I smiled politely, the way a mother does when she's underestimated. But in that moment, I wasn't growing old. I was growing quiet and dangerous. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The china rattled faintly as Helen Carver poured tea into the porcelain cups lined neatly on her back patio table. Her hands, though graceful, trembled just enough to make the liquid waver against the rim. The scent of steeped Earl Grey mingled with the late summer air, cut grass, honeysuckle from the trellis, and the faint tang of horse stables drifting on the breeze from the outskirts of Lexington. Brian leaned back in his chair, scrolling his phone with the distracted air of a man who would rather be anywhere else. Trisha sat upright beside him, her hair sprayed into submission, pearls at her throat. Morgan, across the table, rested her chin on her palm, trying to keep the family brunch from unraveling before it even began. It happened in a blink. Helen reached for the last cup, her hand trembling as she tipped the teapot. Trisha's lips parted into a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Careful, Helen," she said lightly, her tone dripping with false concern. Then the smirk slid in. "Save your energy. You'll need it for the nursing home." The words cracked through the air sharper than a dropped plate. Brian let out a weak chuckle, a nervous noise that vanished quickly. Morgan froze mid-bite, fork suspended, her face blanching. The only sound for a moment was the hum of cicadas in the trees and the clink of the teapot settling back into its cradle. Helen looked at Trisha with the same poise she'd once used to calm unruly customers in her flower shop. She smiled politely, even tilted her head, but her jaw tightened until the muscle at her temple flickered. "That's thoughtful of you," she murmured. "But I think I'll save my energy for something else." Irene Dalton, Helen's oldest friend and brunch regular, leaned closer from her seat, her voice low enough for only Helen to hear. "Don't let that witch win. Smile now. Strike later." Helen let the corner of her mouth lift, hiding the storm brewing behind her eyes. She passed the sugar bowl to Morgan, who still looked stricken, and changed the subject to the roses blooming at the far end of the garden. Trisha smirked as if she had scored a point, sipping her tea with delicate precision. The rest of brunch unfolded like a performance gone stale, Brian mumbling half-hearted updates about work, Trisha steering every conversation back to herself, Morgan and Irene exchanging glances over plates of quiche and fruit salad. Helen stayed composed, pouring more tea, nodding at stories, laughing softly where appropriate, but inside, she was already making calculations. Every clipped word from Trisha planting itself like a seed she intended to grow into something sharp. When the family finally left, the patio fell quiet, the laughter and chatter replaced by the creak of wicker chairs and the whisper of leaves overhead. Irene lingered long enough to squeeze Helen's hand. "You okay?" she asked. Helen gave her the same gentle smile she gave everyone else. "Of course. I'll walk it off after Irene left." Helen gathered the dishes, the faint clink of porcelain against porcelain echoing in the kitchen. She wiped down the counter, rinsed the cups, folded the linen napkins. Every motion was precise, as though order itself might smother the sting of Trisha's remark. By evening, the house was silent except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Helen walked to her front door to lock it and noticed something unusual. A slim stack of brochures had been slipped underneath, their glossy covers fanning across the rug. She bent down slowly, her knees protesting, and picked them up. The bold headline read, "Ridgefield Assisted Living, a Place to Belong." Across the top, in faint print, was a referrer's name, Brian Carver. Helen stood there in the dim light of the entryway, the brochures trembling in her hand. The smirk, the chuckle, the silence. Suddenly, it all connected. Her son and daughter-in-law weren't just making jokes. They were laying groundwork. The house was still. Helen closed the door, locked it, and pressed the brochures flat against the table. She didn't speak. She didn't curse. She simply poured herself a final cup of tea and sat down, staring at the glossy images of smiling seniors playing cards and holding shuffleboard sticks. The porcelain cup was steady in her hand now. Her energy, she decided, would be saved for something far more lasting than a comeback at brunch. The brochures lay spread across Helen Carver's dining table like vultures. Cheerful pastel colors, stock photos of smiling seniors, taglines that promised peace of mind but reeked of exile. Ridgefield Assisted Living had polished its pitch to perfection, but what froze Helen's breath wasn't the glossy images. It was the small line at the top of the referral form. Referrer, Brian Carver. Her son had put his name on her future, like she was a check to be cashed. Helen sat down slowly, the creak of the chair loud in the still house. She touched the paper with her fingertips, then pushed it away as though it burned. The kettle whistled faintly from the kitchen. She'd forgotten she'd left it on. She rose, shut it off, and returned to the table, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. The side door opened a few minutes later without a knock. Irene Dalton shuffled in, hair pinned back, tote bag slung over her shoulder. She took one look at the brochures and whistled low. Well, well, they think you're a soft old woman who won't bite back. Helen's lips twitched. They'll find I still have teeth. Irene dropped her bag on a chair and sat down heavily. Helen, I've known you since we ran that flower shop on Main. You never let a rude customer leave with the last word. Don't you dare let Trisha win this round. Helen rose without answering. She crossed the living room to the small oak cabinet, tucked discreetly beneath her late husband's framed photo. From inside, she pulled out a fireproof lockbox and carried it to the dining table. The sound of the latch clicking open cut through the silence. Inside were the documents of her life. Her will, her power of attorney, insurance statements, deeds, bank files. She spread them out carefully, like arranging stems in a vase. Every paper told a story Trisha had no right to edit. Her phone buzzed. A message from Morgan lit the screen. Grandma, I didn't know they were doing this. I swear, I wasn't part of it. Helen allowed herself a small breath of relief. She typed back, I know, but I do know who was. Morgan's reply came fast. Tell me what to do. Helen stared at the words, her heart tight with both pride and sadness. She typed slowly, just keep your eyes open. That's enough for now. As dusk settled, Helen opened her worn leather ledger and began updating her finances by hand. The smell of ink and paper was comforting, steady. Every column, every figure was written with precision. Control lived in the details, and details were what Trisha would never master. Meanwhile, across town, Trisha's voice was smooth and sweet as she spoke into her phone. She sat at her polished granite kitchen island, sipping Chardonnay, her tone carrying just the right note of concern. Yes, Ridgefield. This is Trisha Carver. I'm following up on the brochures we requested for my mother-in-law. She's slowing down quite a bit. We just want to be proactive, you know. Can we schedule a tour? The intake coordinator jotted down the notes, unaware of the venom behind the smile. Absolutely, Mrs. Carver. We'll put you on the list. Trisha hung up, satisfied, and glanced toward the living room where Brian sat watching television. He gave her a half-hearted smile, already defeated, already compliant. She didn't need his voice, just his silence. Back at her own table, Helen flipped her ledger shut. Her pen lay across the paper like a weapon cooling after use. The brochures still glared at her, false cheer plastered across their covers, but Helen no longer looked at them with dread. She looked at them like fuel. She reached for her phone again, scrolling through her contacts until she found the name she hadn't dialed in years. Her finger hovered only briefly before she pressed call. The line rang twice. Then came the voice, slow, deliberate, familiar. Leonard Briggs, attorney at law. Helen's own voice was steady, clipped. Leonard, it's Helen Carver. I think it's time we talk the next morning. Helen dressed with care. A pressed linen blouse, pearl earrings, her hair smoothed back. not for vanity, armor. She drove the short distance downtown, past Lexington's brick storefronts and tidy horse farms, until the strip mall sign came into view. Briggs and Associates, Elder Law. The parking lot smelled faintly of fresh asphalt, heat rising in waves though the morning sun had barely crested. Inside, the office was cool, smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and coffee. The walls were lined with framed certificates and a few photos of Leonard Briggs at community fundraisers, his smile small but steady. When he stepped from his office, his suit hung a little looser than it once had, but his presence was unchanged, precise, deliberate, impossible to underestimate. "Well, if it isn't Helen Carver," he said, voice slow and warm, but edged with something sharper. His eyes traveled over her outfit, the stiff set of her shoulders. "Long time." "You look ready to fight." Helen allowed herself a small smile. "They want me out of the way, Leonard. Let's make that permanent." He motioned her inside, the leather of his chair creaking as they sat across from one another. He pulled her old file from a cabinet, the folder worn at the corners. Flipping through, he shook his head. "Your current will still names Brian and Trisha as primary heirs. Everything, the house, savings, business shares, it's all theirs." Helen's voice cut in clean, firm. "Not anymore. She gets nothing. He gets less." Leonard raised his brows, then leaned back, tapping a pen against his pad. "We can do that. The simplest path is irrevocable trust. It bypasses probate, locks things tight, and can't be easily challenged. You'll still control everything while you're alive, but the moment you're gone, your wishes are iron." Helen listened carefully, nodding. The words iron and control settled in her chest like balm. She reached into her bag, sliding her updated financial ledger across the desk. "Here's every account, every penny. I've kept it clean." Leonard skimmed it, impressed despite himself. "Cleaner than most people half your age." The office door cracked open. Irene stepped in, carrying a folder of her own and a faint smirk. "Thought you might need backup." Helen gave her a look that was half exasperation, half gratitude. Irene plopped into the chair beside her. "Leonard, if she needs a healthcare proxy, I'll do it." No hesitation, Leonard nodded. "That might be wise. Families often challenge medical decisions first. Having someone outside the bloodline as power of attorney adds weight." Helen turned to Irene, her eyes softening briefly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Irene muttered. "I plan on bossing you around if you're ever stuck in a hospital bed." The three of them worked through options, Morgan as primary heir, the house included, donations to the Lexington Women's Shelter, and layers of protection to choke off any attempt Trisha might make to worm her way back in. Leonard's voice was patient, methodical, explaining every clause until Helen felt the pieces clicking into place. When the meeting ended, Helen left the office with her tote bag heavier with drafts, but her shoulders lighter with resolve. Irene followed, muttering under her breath, "She won't know what hit her." Back home, Helen set the folder on her kitchen counter and poured herself a cup of tea, the steam rising in gentle spirals. The house was quiet, steady. For the first time since the brunch, she felt she was steering the wheel again. Her phone rang, the sharp jangle breaking the calm. She glanced at the screen. Brian. She hesitated, then answered. "Mom," his voice said, oddly bright. "Just checking in. Trisha and I toured Ridgefield today. Place is really nice. Granite countertops, walking trails. I think you'd be comfortable there." Helen stared at the brochures still sitting on her table, her lips curling into a smile that carried no warmth. "How thoughtful," she replied. But as Brian kept talking, describing the amenities like a salesman rehearsing a pitch, Helen's mind sharpened. They thought they were writing her ending. They hadn't realized she'd already found the pen. The next morning, she sat in her rose garden, clippers in hand, pruning with sharp, precise snips. The smell of damp soil and petals wrapped around her, grounding her thoughts. They had walked Ridgefield's halls as if she were already gone, peering into rooms like buyers inspecting a property. And they'd come back with brochures circled in pen, Her phone buzzed on the patio table. A message from Morgan. "Grandma, I thought you should see this." Attached was a photo. Trisha standing in Ridgefield's lobby, holding a glossy brochure. Her manicured finger rested squarely on a unit listing, where someone had circled "available now" in thick black ink. Helen's jaw tightened. She set down the clippers and texted back. "If they want a vacancy, I'll give them one. In my will." That afternoon, she returned to Leonard Briggs's office, her tote bag loaded with drafts. Leonard glanced up from behind his desk, his expression sharpening as she slid the photo across to him. "They've gone from suggestion to prearrangement," Helen said, her voice calm but firm. Leonard adjusted his glasses, nodding slowly. "Then it's time to finalize the countermeasure." They spread the documents across his desk, the new trust language, preliminary drafts of her will, donation clauses. Helen's finger traced the keyline. Morgan as the primary heir, the estate filtered through a controlled trust to protect her from interference. Irene as healthcare proxy, the Lexington Women's Shelter listed for a meaningful donation. "She gets nothing," Helen repeated, her voice hardening. "And he gets less," Leonard finished for her, a hint of wryness in his tone. "Yes, I remember." For hours they combed through wording, Leonard precise with every clause. Helen listened, asked questions, underlined sections in red pen. By the end of it, the future felt less like something to fear and more like something she was shaping with deliberate strokes. That evening, Helen returned home to find Trisha already waiting on her porch, arms folded, smile stretched too thin. "Lovely evening," Trisha said, her eyes darting past Helen toward the front. "Dr. Brian and I were just talking. Maybe you should give us a copy of your house key, just in case something happens. Emergencies, medical situations. You'd want us to be able to check in." Helen unlocked the door and held it open, gesturing politely. How thoughtful, but her eyes glinted sharp behind her glasses. She didn't comment further, and Trisha, perhaps sensing the line had been overplayed, retreated with a parting smile that felt more like a dare. Inside, Helen set her bag on the table and walked through her house slowly, the quiet pressing close. She made tea, the kettle's hiss filling the kitchen, and tried to shake off the feeling of intrusion. But something tugged at her instincts, an itch she couldn't dismiss. She carried her cup down the hallway, pausing at the guest room. The door was closed, but she never closed it. Helen turned the knob, the faint creak echoing. The closet door was ajar, hangers shifted, boxes nudged out of their precise alignment. The faint scent of lavender sachets she always tucked in drawers was broken by something else. Trisha's perfume, cloying and citrusy, hanging faintly in the air. Helen set her teacup down on the dresser, her hands steady even as her pulse surged. The message was clear. Trisha wasn't just circling brochures anymore. She was circling Helen's life, piece by piece, room by room. And Helen, lips pressed thin, decided the war had officially begun. The ink dried in deliberate strokes, each signature pressed with the precision of a woman who knew the weight of permanence. Helen sat in Leonard Briggs's office, the afternoon light slanting through the blinds in sharp stripes across the desk. Outside, traffic murmured on the road, but in here every sound was magnified. The scratch of the pen, the shuffle of paper, the creak of leather chairs. "This is it," Leonard said, steady as stone. "The new will." Helen leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. "Read it to me one more time." Leonard obliged, his voice even. "Trisha Carver receives nothing. Brian Carver, token inheritance of $100. Morgan Carver, primary heir, with the estate to be transferred through a controlled trust to prevent misuse. Irene Dalton named healthcare proxy, and a portion, 10%, pledged to the Lexington Women's Shelter." Helen's lips pressed into a thin smile. "Perfect. Now she'll know exactly how much she means to me." Leonard slid the last page forward. "And finally, the no contest clause. If Brian or Trisha attempt to challenge this will, they forfeit even the $100. It's airtight. Helen picked up the pen, the same pen Morgan had gifted her years ago for balancing the shop's books, still smooth in her hand, and signed with slow, deliberate care. Every curve of her name felt like a blade carving into stone. When she set the pen down, Irene clapped her hands once, sharp as applause. Well, that's that. Trisha can choke on her smirk. Helen exhaled, not with relief, but with the cool satisfaction of a teacher grading a paper she knew had failed. She mocked my future. Now she has no part in it. The drive home was quiet. The streets lined with horse farms, and the faint scent of hay drifting through the open window. Helen's tote bag sat on the passenger seat, the documents inside heavy but protective. For the first time in weeks, she felt armored. That evening, she brewed herself a pot of chamomile, the floral scent filling the kitchen. She carried the cup to her rose garden, the petals catching the last rays of sunlight, glowing crimson against the twilight. She knelt to deadhead a rose, her hands steady now, and whispered, all in order, but peace never lingered long. The next afternoon, Helen was in her living room, sorting receipts into careful stacks, when the doorbell rang. She wiped her hands on her linen skirt and opened the door. There stood Trisha, not alone, but with a man in a blazer carrying a briefcase. The faint tang of expensive perfume hit Helen first, then the sight of papers in Trisha's manicured hand. Her smile was too wide, too rehearsed. Hi, Helen, Trisha said sweetly. We thought we'd stop by to help. This is Mark. He's a notary. We've drawn up a new power of attorney form for you. Just needs your signature. Easy, quick, nothing to worry about. The notary nodded politely, oblivious to the venom humming beneath Trisha's smile. Helen stood framed in the doorway, sunlight haloing her figure. She didn't flinch, didn't move. Her mind raced, but her expression was calm, almost amused. Trisha raised the papers higher, her eyes gleaming with triumph. Shall we go ahead and sign? Helen's fingers tightened on the doorframe, her lips curling into the faintest smile. She'd already written Trisha out of the future, but now the woman was bold enough to bring reinforcements to her doorstep. The war had left the shadows. It had arrived at her front door, pen in hand. The papers were already on the coffee table, the notary perched stiffly in an armchair, and Trisha's smile stretched wide, as if she were doing Helen a kindness. Helen sank into her couch, her posture a touch slouched, her fingers trembling just enough to sell the picture. Trisha tapped the top page with her manicured nail. You need to sign this so we can help manage your meds, your bills, the everyday things. Nothing scary, just easier for everyone. Helen tilted her head, blinking slowly. I don't always catch things the first time. Why don't you explain it to me, nice and slow? Trisha lit up, convinced she had her. She launched into the clauses, her voice syrupy, each sentence dripping with false care. This gives Brian and me the ability to act on your behalf. We'll keep your prescription straight. Make sure bills don't slip through the cracks. You won't have to worry from the hallway, hidden by the door frame. Morgan lifted her phone. The red recording light glowed steady as she captured Trisha's performance. Every calculated phrase, every predatory pause. Helen leaned forward, squinting at the text. So, if I sign this, you'll be in charge of all my money. Trisha's laugh was gentle, too gentle. Not in charge, just helping. Think of it as teamwork. Helen nodded slowly, as if mulling it over. Her hand drifted toward the pen Trisha had placed before her. She let her fingers brush it, then lifted her eyes. Gone was the feigned confusion. Her gaze sharpened like a blade. I already have a power of attorney, dear, Helen said smoothly, her voice suddenly strong. Filed years ago. Legal. Binding. You're a bit late. The words landed with the weight of a slammed door. The notary shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Trisha, whose smile faltered into something jagged. Excuse me, Trisha hissed, the sweetness draining. Helen pushed the unsigned papers back across the table, the motion precise. Final. I said no. And no is a complete sentence. The notary cleared his throat, muttered something about other appointments, and stuffed his briefcase closed. Within moments, he was out the door, leaving the two women alone. Trisha stood frozen, her face blotched red. You've been playing me. Helen lifted her teacup steady as ever and took a sip. Pretending, yes. Playing? Never. Trisha's breath came sharp, her eyes narrowing into slits. You're not nearly as weak as you pretend to be. Helen smiled, calm and unbothered. You finally noticed. By nightfall, the video was in Leonard Briggs's inbox. The next morning he called, his voice carrying quiet satisfaction. It's solid evidence, Helen. An attempted coercion caught on video, with a notary present no less. I filed an incident report with the state bar. If she tries anything else, this will follow her like a shadow. Helen stood at her kitchen counter, watering the roses she kept in a glass vase. The petals glistened, drops sliding down like beads of defiance. She brought her own pen, she said, her tone cool. But I had the paper that mattered. Leonard chuckled softly. And the foresight. For a moment, Helen felt the sweet taste of victory, but victories in her world were fragile things. 2 days later, she stepped into the pharmacy, the familiar antiseptic scent greeting her as she handed her card across the counter. The pharmacist scanned her prescription bag, the register beeping cheerfully until the screen flashed red. I'm sorry, Mrs. Carver, the clerk said, frowning. Your card's been declined. Helen blinked, her hand still on the counter. Declined? The clerk tried again. Same result. A line of customers formed behind her, shifting impatiently. Helen stood tall, though her stomach twisted. Her finances were balanced down to the penny. She knew this. This wasn't error, it was interference. Helen took back her card, her jaw tightening. If Trisha thought she'd been outplayed in the living room, she was already moving the battle to the bank. And Helen, purse in hand, stepped into the late afternoon sun with fire in her chest. Someone had touched her accounts. The war had just escalated. Helen set her unopened pharmacy bag on the kitchen counter, but her mind wasn't on medicine. Declined. That single word had burned itself into her, sharper than Trisha's insults, more cutting than Brian's silence. She reached for the phone, her fingers steady despite the churn in her chest. Leonard, she said when he answered. Something's wrong with my money. Check the joint account I shared with James. I never fully closed it. There was a small balance left. Hours later, Leonard called back. His voice was calm, but the edge underneath was unmistakable. Helen, we've confirmed a withdrawal. $3,800. Not at the bank. It was routed through an online investment account. He paused, then added, the account is registered under Brian's name. For a moment, the room seemed to still. Helen rested her palm flat on the table, grounding herself in the cool wood grain. Her son hadn't just stood by while Trisha schemed. He had reached into her pocket with his own hand. Freeze it, she said flatly. Every account connected to my name. I'll open new ones solo. No trace left. You'll have it by morning, Leonard assured her. And Helen, this isn't just theft. This qualifies as elder fraud. If you want to pursue it, we'll have teeth. Helen ended the call, her jaw set. The roses swayed outside her window in the evening breeze, red blooms like small banners. She had spent her life pruning away the weak stems so stronger ones could thrive. This would be no different. By nightfall, Irene arrived, casserole in hand, the smell of cheese and onions trailing behind her. Helen told her what Leonard had found. Irene slammed her palm against the table, rattling the silverware. That's not a mistake, Helen. That's elder fraud, plain as day. He can dress it up in excuses, but stealing from your mother isn't caregiving. It's a crime. Helen gave a thin smile, then let him choke on the paperwork. The next day, Morgan came by with her laptop, her expression tight with worry. I pulled the digital logs, she said, setting the computer on the table. Your old joint account was still linked here. Look, rows of transfers scrolled across the screen, each stamped with dates, amounts, destinations. At the bottom, recipient, Brian Carver, investment portfolio. Morgan's voice broke. He didn't even try to hide it, Grandma. Helen put an arm around her granddaughter, steadying her. People who think they own you never bother to cover their tracks. Together, they printed the logs, the machine humming as evidence stacked higher and higher. The smell of warm ink filled the kitchen. Every page another nail in the coffin of Brian's defense. When Helen carried the stack to Leonard's office, he flipped through each page, his eyes narrowing with satisfaction. He tapped the top of the pile against his desk, aligning it perfectly. This is airtight. I'll file restitution paperwork today. If Brian refuses to return the funds, we'll push for charges. And believe me, judges take elder fraud seriously, Helen nodded. Do it. He tested my balance. I'll unbalance everything he thought was steady. Leonard leaned back in his chair, a rare smile flickering across his face. You've got them cornered, Helen. They're the ones scrambling now. Back home, Helen brewed herself tea, chamomile steeping soft and fragrant, and carried the cup to her rose garden. The sky was heavy with clouds, the air charged with a storm that hadn't yet broken. She walked the rose slowly, running her fingertips over the petals, reminding herself she still held beauty, control, and time. The knock came just after dusk. A courier stood on the porch with a thick envelope. Helen signed for it, the pen scratching against paper, and carried it to her dining room table. She slid it open carefully with her letter opener, steam from her tea curling nearby. Inside was a court summons. Brian and Trisha weren't retreating. They were contesting her will. Helen smoothed the papers flat against the tablecloth, her expression calm, almost serene. Let them come. She had sharpened her weapons in silence. The courtroom would be her garden now. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, a blend that clung to its marbled halls. Helen stepped through the double doors of probate court in an all-white suit, crisp as chalk. Her pearls caught the light, her hair was pinned neatly, and she moved with the calm grace of someone who'd already chosen her battlefield. The room quieted when she entered. Brian and Trisha sat at the petitioner's table, Trisha whispering sharply in his ear, her lipstick too red, her posture too rigid. Brian looked tired, gray around the edges, his eyes darting anywhere but toward his mother. Leonard rose beside Helen, slow and deliberate. His presence was steady, a stone against the storm. He guided her to their table, laid out the files, and whispered, "Keep steady. We'll let them bury themselves." The judge, a stern man with silver hair and a gaze sharp as glass, called the hearing to order. Trisha stood first, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached the bench. She spoke with affected concern, her voice lilting, rehearsed. "Your Honor, we're only here because Helen has become mentally inconsistent. She forgets things. She's vulnerable. She's being manipulated into decisions that don't reflect her true intentions. We only want what's best for her." Helen's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression calm, folding her hands neatly on the table. Leonard rose with measured patience. "Your Honor, before we accept any accusations, I'd like to introduce evidence." He pressed a button, and the courtroom filled with sound. Trisha's voice, sweet and sharp, explaining a fraudulent power of attorney, coaxing, pushing, insisting. The video played on a screen, Morgan's hidden camera capturing every word, every false smile. The murmurs that rippled through the courtroom were unmistakable. Trisha's face, drained of color, Brian shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his tie. When the video ended, Leonard let the silence linger before he spoke. "This is not care. This is coercion." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Compelling evidence." Next, Leonard called Morgan to the stand. She walked forward with steady steps, though her fingers curled tight around her notebook. She raised her hand, swore in, and turned to face the courtroom. "She's the sharpest woman I know," Morgan said, her voice firm. "She still balances her own ledgers, keeps track of every bill. She taught me that details matter, that you don't leave loose ends." She hasn't forgotten a thing. Trisha shifted, trying to mask her fury behind a fixed smile. Brian's gaze sank to the floor. Finally, Leonard called Irene. She strode to the witness chair with no hesitation, adjusting her glasses. "Helen doesn't need caretakers. She manages her meds, her house, her garden, and her life. You'd be lucky to keep up with her," her voice sharpened. "What she doesn't need is family trying to cash her out while she's still alive." The courtroom chuckled softly at that, a ripple the judge didn't stop. He leaned back, hands steepled. "Given the claims, I am ordering a psychological evaluation of Mrs. Carver. Not because I doubt her, but because it will close this matter once and for all." Helen inclined her head, her voice steady. "I welcome it, Your Honor." The gavel struck once, echoing through the chamber. The day's session adjourned, the room buzzing as people rose from their benches. Trisha's face had soured into a mask of defeat, though her eyes still glimmered with venom. Brian trailed after her, shoulders sagging, his silence now a louder indictment than any word he could have spoken. As the courtroom emptied, Leonard gathered the files into his briefcase. But one folder at the bottom caught his eye, something that hadn't been there before. He opened it, flipping through documents that smelled faintly of fresh ink. His brows furrowed. The papers were life insurance forms, dated years back, allegedly from Helen's late husband. But the signature, it wasn't right. It was off, too fluid, too practiced. And the beneficiary listed? Trisha Carver. Leonard closed the folder slowly, his lips pressing into a thin line. When he looked up at Helen, his eyes carried a new weight. "They didn't just tamper with your future," he murmured. "They've tried to rewrite your past." The memory of Leonard sliding the insurance paperwork across the desk still burned in Helen's mind. The ink too neat, the date too wrong, the beneficiary's name too familiar. She hadn't slept much since. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw James's real signature, bold and impatient, scrawled across old checks and anniversary cards. The counterfeit version mocked it, a cheap shadow of a life lived honestly. By morning, Helen was back in Leonard's office, determination crisp in her every movement. She wore no pearls this time, only a dark jacket and a look sharp enough to cut glass. Leonard placed the folder between them, his expression grave. "We're not debating suspicion anymore," he said. "This is fraud." Helen pulled the affidavit closer, the smell of toner rising faintly from the fresh pages. The words were formal, clinical, but the meaning dripped with betrayal. "I, Helen Carver, did not authorize." She signed her name with deliberate force, the pen biting into the paper. Each letter felt less like ink and more like a blade, carving truth into permanence. Leonard gathered the document carefully. "That covers the affidavit for the insurer." Now he slid another form forward. "This is the criminal complaint. It puts Trisha directly in the line of fire. You're ready?" Helen looked up, her eyes steady. "She forged James's memory." "That's unforgivable. File it by the end of the week." The complaint was in the court's hands. During the next probate session, the judge's gavel struck with finality. "All probate appeals are hereby suspended," he declared. "No inheritance disputes may proceed until the fraud investigation is resolved." The words echoed through the courtroom like thunder rolling across open fields. Trisha's jaw dropped, color draining from her face before a blush of rage crept back in. Brian stared at the table, shoulders curved inward, the silence around him louder than anything he could have said. Helen sat poised, hands folded neatly in her lap, as though she had simply waited for this moment all along. Outside the courthouse, Irene caught her arm, eyes blazing. "You've just cut the rope they were climbing. They'll hit the ground hard." Helen allowed herself the faintest smile. "They forged my past. I just rewrote their future. But even victories carried consequences. The following Tuesday, Helen sat at her kitchen table with a steaming cup of Earl Grey, sunlight catching the rim of her cup. Her phone rang, an unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. She answered, her tone crisp. "Mrs. Carver, this is Patricia Stone, HR Director at Lexington HR Consulting. I'm reaching out regarding Trisha Carver, who's listed you as a reference in past employment files." The woman's voice was smooth, professional, but Helen caught the careful undertone. "We've received an anonymous tip suggesting concerning behavior. Before we proceed internally, we'd like to verify her character. Would you be willing to provide insight?" Helen's eyes drifted toward the roses outside her window, their petals bright and defiant against the late morning light. The irony wasn't lost on her. Trisha had spent months trying to write her off as a burden, a fading shadow. Now her own employer was questioning her integrity and asking Helen to hold the pen. Helen let the silence stretch, savoring it. She set her teacup down with a soft clink, adjusted her glasses, and spoke evenly. "Yes," she said, "I have plenty of insight." The pause on the other end told her the HR director understood the weight behind the words. Helen leaned back in her chair, her heart steady. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was on defense. She was writing the next act. The roses were in bloom the morning Helen handed Leonard a manila envelope thick with evidence. Inside lay everything: fraudulent insurance documents, transfer logs, and most damning, the recording of Trisha coaxing her into signing away control of her life. Helen's handwriting was neat across the cover. Proof of character. Leonard lifted the folder with careful hands. "I'll forward this directly to her firm's HR department. Once they see this, her mask won't hold." Helen nodded, her jaw set. She played caretaker in public. Let them see the actress she really is. 2 weeks later, word spread quietly but swiftly. Helen sat on her porch with Irene, sipping iced tea, when Morgan came bounding up the walk with her phone in hand, eyes wide. "It's official," she said, breathlessly. "Trisha's been placed on leave. HR is conducting a full investigation." Helen leaned back in her wicker chair, the creak of the wood sharp in the silence. She took a long sip, tasting victory in the cold sweetness of the tea. Across from her, Irene grinned like a cat with cream. "Well," Irene said, raising her glass in a mock toast, "guess she'll need her own energy now." The women laughed, the sound mingling with the hum of cicadas. But the laughter didn't last long. Brian showed up that evening, his car pulling into Helen's driveway like a guilty shadow. He stood at the door, hair mussed, eyes downcast, hands jammed into his pockets. Helen opened the door just wide enough to see him, her expression unreadable. "Mom," he started, his voice low, "this has gone too far. Trisha's job is at stake. She's unraveling. Maybe we can stop all this. Reconsider the will." Smooth things over, Helen studied him for a long moment, her silence, pressing harder than words. Finally she spoke, her tone as sharp as the clippers she used in her rose garden. "You chose silence when she mocked me. You chose silence when she stole from me. That's what you'll inherit. Silence." Brian flinched, his shoulders sagging. He turned without another word, retreating to the car that had once brought him home as a boy. Helen closed the door softly, locking it with a click that echoed finality. Later that week, Morgan sat at Helen's dining table, laptop open, papers spread across the surface. She was drafting a case study for her legal studies professor, her fingers flying across the keys. "This isn't just about you, Grandma. This is textbook elder fraud. My professor said real-world cases like this change policy." Helen poured her another cup of tea, setting it beside the laptop. "Then make sure they remember the name Carver, for the right reason." The pride in Morgan's eyes warmed her more than the tea ever could. But victory carried shadows. On Friday evening, Helen returned from trimming her roses to find an envelope slipped under her door. No stamp, no address, just her name written in jagged block letters. She carried it to the kitchen, the paper rough against her fingertips. With her letter opener, she sliced it open and pulled out a single sheet. The handwriting inside was messy, hurried, but the words were clear. "You'll regret this." The paper smelled faintly of smoke and cologne. Helen's hand didn't tremble as she set it on the counter, but her jaw locked, her chest heavy. The war had left the courthouse, left the offices, and now slipped straight into her home. She reached for her phone, her reflection in the darkened window, staring back at her, steady and unflinching. Whoever had sent it didn't understand. She'd already survived worse. The letter lay on Leonard's desk inside a plastic sleeve, its blocky handwriting glaring from the page. Helen sat opposite him, her posture upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had carried it here herself, tucked in an envelope, untouched since it arrived. "They slipped it under my door," she said evenly. "No postage, no return address, just 3 words. You'll regret this." Leonard's jaw tightened as he studied the sheet. The faint smell of smoke still clung to the paper, acrid, like a fireplace that hadn't been cleaned. "You did the right thing not touching it more than you had to." He buzzed his assistant, who entered with latex gloves and a sealed evidence bag. The paper slid inside with a whisper. "We'll have it fingerprinted," Leonard said. "But Helen, this isn't just intimidation, it's evidence. The court needs to see this." Helen inclined her head. "Let them. Fear isn't a language I speak anymore." That afternoon, Morgan arrived at Helen's kitchen with her laptop and portable printer, determination sharp in her face. "I've been thinking," she said, "if whoever wrote that letter used a home printer, maybe the cartridge pattern could match." Helen raised a brow. "You can tell that from the ink?" Morgan grinned faintly. "Every cartridge leaves a fingerprint of its own, tiny imperfections. If I print the same words side by side, I can compare." Together, they fed the printer the phrase, "You'll regret this." The letters spilled out, black on white, the hum of the machine filling the kitchen. Morgan held the sheet against the original under lamplight. The patterns of stray dots aligned, faint but unmistakable. Her face paled. "Grandma, this matches the printer at Dad and Trisha's house." Silence settled heavy in the room. Helen sipped her tea, calm as stone. "So they left a trail from their front door to mine." By the next morning, Leonard had filed the finding with the court. He stood before the judge, laying out the evidence with slow precision. The letter, the fingerprint request, Morgan's comparative analysis. The courtroom air was thick, buzzing with murmurs. The judge leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "This court considers intimidation a serious matter. If proven, additional charges will be added. And if the Carvers are linked, it will not go lightly." Trisha sat rigid, her lipstick cracking at the corners, her jaw clenched. Brian slumped lower, hands pressed between his knees. Afterward, Helen returned home to her roses, trimming the buds with practiced snips. The smell of cut stems and the fresh earth filled the air, grounding her. Every clipped stem reminded her of pruning a life back to what mattered. Irene joined her, carrying 2 tall glasses of iced tea. She set one down on the patio table, eyeing the neat piles of trimmings. "You're building peace from their poison, Helen." That's a rare thing. Helen allowed herself a small smile. Roses thrive when you take away what drags them down. People are no different. That evening, Helen met Leonard again, this time to finalize her living trust. The office smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Leonard slid the final document across the desk. "This makes it airtight. 2 alternate heirs, Morgan and the Lexington Women's Shelter. If anything happens to one, the other inherits directly. There's no door left for Brian or Trisha to push through." Helen signed with a flourish, her hand steady, her name bold against the page. When she handed the pen back, she felt lighter, as if years had been shed. But the next morning, peace gave way to a new ripple. Irene arrived waving her phone, her face half amused, half shocked. "Helen, You're not just local gossip anymore. Helen frowned, setting down her pruning shears. What do you mean? Irene thrust the phone into her hand. On the screen was a regional news blog. The headline read, Senior Outsmarts Family in Estate Battle. A case study in elder resilience. Helen's roses swayed in the breeze around her, crimson and unbending, as she read her own story, broadcast to strangers, now bigger than the quiet war in her cul-de-sac. The article told her story cleanly, almost clinically, but with enough bite to sting her enemies. It spoke of fraudulent documents, contested wills, and a matriarch who refused to be silenced. By noon, it had been shared hundreds of times. By evening, thousands. Flowers started arriving within days. Bouquets lined her porch, carried by delivery drivers who tipped their caps politely. Roses, lilies, sunflowers, every vase and jar in her home soon bristled with color and scent. Some came with cards signed only by first names, for strength, for dignity, for reminding us all what resilience looks like. Helen would pause each time she arranged a vase, the fragrance filling her lungs, and wonder who those strangers were. People she'd never met were cheering her on, while her own son sat silent in shame. Trisha, however, wasn't silent. She was cornered. News trickled out that she had resigned from her HR firm. The official line was personal reasons, but Helen knew better. A firm that prided itself on integrity could not keep an employee exposed for coercion, forgery, and intimidation. Helen imagined Trisha clearing out her desk. The smug confidence she'd once worn like perfume stripped bare. Brian seemed to vanish. No phone calls, no knocks at her door, no sideways glances from his car in the cul-de-sac. His social media went dark. His face disappeared from company websites. To the world, it was as if he had slipped through the cracks, retreating into the shadows. Morgan sat across from Helen one afternoon, laptop open, scrolling through the endless comments under the article. You did more than win, Grandma, she said softly. People are talking about you like you're a case study, an example. You're changing how others see elder law. Helen smiled faintly, adjusting her teacup on its saucer. I never asked to be an example, but if my fight gives someone else courage, then it's worth the noise. Later that week, Leonard called with a tone Helen hadn't heard before, something close to admiration. You didn't just protect yourself, he told her. You rewrote legacy law in this county. I've had 2 colleagues call me already, asking how you pulled it off. Your case will be cited for years. Helen listened, the weight of his words sinking in. She had spent her life running a flower shop, pruning roses, teaching Morgan the patience of growth, and now her name was reshaping the very laws meant to protect the vulnerable. It felt strange, powerful, and humbling all at once. But just as quickly as flowers can bloom, rot can set in. That evening, Helen's landline rang. The old rotary phone sat on a lace doily in her hallway, its ring slicing through the quiet. She lifted the receiver, expecting Irene or perhaps Morgan. Helen had ignored it for hours, busying herself with the small rituals that gave order to her days. Watering the roses, folding linen napkins, polishing the silver spoons Seth James had left behind. But the blinking persisted, stubborn and insistent. Finally, she pressed play. Trisha's voice poured through the speaker, broken and raw. Helen, please talk to me. I was wrong. I didn't mean for things to go this far. I've lost everything, my job, my reputation. I just want to make it right. Just don't leave me like this. Please? The words echoed through the quiet kitchen. Helen stood motionless, her hands resting on the edge of the counter. She could hear the ragged breaths between Trisha's sentences, the desperation curling through every syllable. Once that tone might have stirred pity in her, but not anymore. When the message ended, Helen reached for the button. With a simple press, the voice was erased, silenced forever. No second listen, no reply. Her next call was her own. She dialed Morgan's number, the sound of her granddaughter's voice warm and steady when it answered. Grandma, Helen's lips curved faintly. I just wanted to tell you something. What's that? I'm proud of you, Helen said, her voice soft but firm. Not just for standing by me, but for becoming the kind of woman who knows when to fight and when to walk away. That's rarer than you think. There was a pause, then Morgan's voice, tight with emotion. You taught me that, Grandma. After she hung up, Helen carried 2 wine glasses into the garden, where Irene was waiting. The evening air was thick with the scent of roses, petals glowing faintly in the golden light. Fireflies flickered at the edges of the yard, tiny sparks in the growing dusk. Irene raised her glass. To pruning out the weeds, she said. Helen clinked hers against it. And letting the flowers breathe. They drank deeply, the chilled wine sharp and clean on the tongue, the kind that left warmth in the chest long after the sip. For the first time in months, Helen felt a deep, quiet peace settle over her. The next morning, Leonard's envelope arrived by courier. Inside was the final deed transfer, Morgan's name, written where Brian's and Trisha's would never again appear. Helen smoothed the document flat on the table, her fingers brushing the embossed seal. The house that had once sheltered 3 generations was no longer tethered to the chains of obligation. She called Morgan that afternoon. It's official, she said simply. Morgan's voice broke with joy. Grandma, I don't know what to say. You don't have to, Helen replied. The walls will keep their stories, and now they're yours. That evening, Helen wrote a check for $15,000 to the Lexington Women's Shelter. She tucked it into an envelope with steady hands, the ink of her signature bold, her name standing as a promise. She had cut away the rot of betrayal. Now she would plant something lasting in its place. The pen slowly between her fingers, the weight both comforting and immense. Morgan had given her many gifts over the years. Flowers pressed into books, handmade cards, nervous smiles, but none as heavy with meaning as this. On Leonard's desk lay the final amendment to her trust. The document was pristine, the language airtight, the culmination of months of planning and pruning. Helen leaned forward, uncapped the pen with a soft click, and pressed the nib to the page. The ink bled sharp and black, flowing steady as her breath. With each stroke of her name, she felt the last tether to Brian and Trisha cut clean. When she finished, she set the pen down gently, not with relief, but with satisfaction. Done, she said. Morgan leaned closer, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. Grandma, you changed how I see family. Not just ours. The whole idea of it. Helen's lips curved, her gaze locking with her granddaughter's. We teach people how to treat us, Morgan, even in silence. Sometimes, especially in silence. Leonard slid the signed papers into his folder, his expression warm, almost reverent. I've done this work for decades, he said quietly, and I've never seen someone turn a fight into a legacy quite like you. This will outlive all of us outside, Lexington buzzed with its ordinary hum, the sound of traffic on limestone roads, the faint whinny of horses in distant paddocks. But in that office, time felt suspended, as though Helen's signature had not just sealed a trust, but closed a chapter of history. That weekend, Helen received a letter from the local community center. Folded neatly in cream stationery, the message invited her to speak at an upcoming event on resilience and elder advocacy. She read the lines twice, then a third time, her fingers brushing the embossed logo at the top. Irene, perched on Helen's sofa with a bowl of grapes, let out a laugh when she heard. Well, honey, you're a legend now. They'll be carving your name into plaques if you're not careful. Helen smirked, plucking a grape from the bowl. I never cared for plaques. But if my words can help even one woman walk into a lawyer's office before her children walk into her bank account, then I'll speak. The 2 women clinked their teacups together, laughter mixing with the soft hum of cicadas outside. That night, Helen wandered into her bedroom, the air cool with the faint scent of lavender from her drawer sachets. She stood before her cedar memory box, untouched for years. The box was smooth, worn by decades of fingertips, its brass latch still firm. She had avoided it since James's passing, knowing it contained both comfort and ache. For a moment she hesitated, her hand hovering above the lid, but something about the pen in her pocket, the final word, the ink of closure, pushed her forward. She unlatched the box, the click loud in the quiet room, and lifted the lid. Inside, beneath a stack of old photographs and yellowed receipts from their flower shop, was an envelope she had never opened. Her breath caught. James's handwriting curled across the front in bold, hurried strokes. "For Helen, when you're ready." The paper was still sealed, its edges fragile, the faint scent of cedar clinging to it after all these years. Helen touched the envelope with trembling fingers, her heart thudding, the weight of time pressing in. She drew in a steady breath. Ready or not, the past had just stepped into her present. Her thumb traced the edge of the paper, brittle with years. She drew a breath and slid her letter opener beneath the flap. The sound of the tear was delicate, almost reverent, like the rustle of petals falling. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, his handwriting, sprawling across it. "You'll always know what to do, even if I'm not there to say it. You have more strength than you believe, Helen. Don't let anyone shrink it. Not our son, not the world. Trust yourself. You'll always know." Her vision blurred, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of memory. She could almost hear his voice, steady and teasing, the way he used to say her name when they locked up the flower shop at night. She pressed the letter against her chest, a sigh breaking loose. Later that week, she framed it, James's note, beside the engraved pen Morgan had given her. They hung side by side on the wall of her study, letter and pen, past and present. One was a reminder of who she had been, the other a symbol of who she had become. Together, they were her monument. The deed transfer arrived by courier on a Tuesday. Helen opened it at her dining table, the light slanting across the wood, her teacup steaming nearby. At the bottom of the page, in bold print, was Morgan's name. The house, the land, the walls that had seen every betrayal and every triumph belonged to her granddaughter now. No loopholes, no disputes. Final. Morgan hugged her so tightly when she told her that Helen nearly lost her breath. "I'll take care of it," Morgan whispered, her voice thick, "just like you taught me." But Morgan's ambitions were reaching further. A week later, an acceptance letter arrived from the University of Kentucky College of Law. Morgan burst through Helen's front door, waving the envelope, tears streaking down her cheeks. "Elder law," she cried. "I'm specializing in elder law." "Because of you," Grandma Helen cupped her granddaughter's face, proud and unflinching. "Then you'll make sure no one else has to fight this battle alone." Irene joined them that evening, bringing champagne instead of iced tea. They toasted in the kitchen, bubbles fizzing in their glasses, laughter filling the air. For the first time in months, Helen felt the house echo with something lighter than tension, joy, fierce and unguarded. A few days later, Helen visited the botanical garden, a place where she and James had once strolled hand in hand. The air was rich with the perfume of lilies and damp earth, the gravel crunching softly beneath her shoes. She carried a single rose from her garden, deep red, its stem wrapped in ribbon. She stopped at the legacy bench, a stone seat engraved with names of donors long gone. She set the rose gently on the cool surface, her fingers lingering. "We did it, James," she whispered. "Everything's in order. They can't touch it now." Back at Leonard's office, she met with him one final time. He flipped through the thick file, every page in order, every seal stamped. He looked up with quiet satisfaction. "Everything's airtight. You won," Helen smiled. Not in triumph, but in peace. Winning wasn't the goal. But it's a nice ending. As she left his office, the sun struck the glass frame at home, glinting off the pen and the letter. The words of her husband's note glowed faintly in the light. "You'll always know what to do." And she had. She had known when to smile through insult, when to sharpen silence into steel, and when to sign her name so boldly it erased generations of entitlement. Her voice carried steady as she poured herself a final glass of wine that evening, the roses swaying outside her window like silent witnesses. My daughter-in-law mocked me once, she murmured, raising the glass. But I saved my energy for cutting her out.